Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. Today we're looking at Heroic Iron Quan and Throne of Thunder. And this fight is about moderate difficulty. This was our 6th heroic kill, which is about right. I would say Council is probably more difficult in this fight. We just happened to do it in that order because that was easier for the raid in that week. But yeah, if you're looking for a 4th fight, maybe a 5th to work on, this is a good one. After stuff like G-Kun and Tordos, Jinrock, Horadon, all that good stuff. Okay, so as for the mechanics and the guide here, we'll start with a little bit of raid comp stuff because there is actually a few things you can try there that'll change your overall composition, as well as then go through the phases themselves and talk about how they change on heroic compared to the normal. And that's really the easiest way to explain this fight. So let's get started. So the first consideration before you even start making attempts on this fight is your raid composition. And the main thing to decide first is how many tanks you're going to use. So this is one of those fights where you actually have the choice to utilize 1 tank if you find that you don't need 2 tanks for this encounter. And the only thing in this fight that dictates the use of 2 tanks in the first place is the stacking impale debuff that's applied to the tank. And this does about 45,000 physical damage every 2 seconds per stack and stacks up to about 30. So normally you would taunt back and forth between the tanks throughout the fight to keep this stack low. However, if you only need 1 tank on this fight, you can obviously add a healer in the place of the 2nd tank or another DPS for more damage. And additionally, your primary tank will also do more DPS since their vengeance will be higher. So all around, I highly recommend the 1 tank strategy. The way it works is similar to Heroic Horadon. If you're used to that encounter, you saw the video. Essentially, you need at least 1 paladin in your raid for Hand of Protection. Basically, you use a Hand of Protection at the end of every transition phase from one dog to the next. And with the exception of the sort of wind phase, you likely don't need one because during this windstorm that you're seeing right here, in fact, generally this is enough time for the impale to drop on its own without the need for a Hand of Protection. But basically 1 paladin with clemency should be enough to clear it, or if your tank is a paladin, then he or she can also do it on their own. So in our case, our tank is our paladin, and it works just fine there. So that's pretty much it. If you want to 1 tank it, you're probably going to need Hand of Protection. I don't think there's any other way to get rid of it that comes to mind anyway. But it's very handy because in our case, we were actually able to use 3 healers and still maintain the same DPS, actually slightly higher than if we had 2 tanks. Again, because of Vengeance and then our other tank actually being a DPS player. So yeah, decide on your tank setup first, and then from there you can also decide your healer count. 2 healing is certainly possible, but with a 1 tank method, I think 3 healing is more stable, and because you're not going to be running up against the Berserk timer, especially if you use 1 tank, then extra healing, the stability of a 3rd healer is very handy. So that would be my suggestion, is if you're 1 tanking especially, go with 3 healers. If you're 2 tanking, then you can probably do 2 healers. You just have to be really good about your cooldowns in the last phase and all that. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So the primary change for Heroic is that unlike normal, when you deal with one of the particular dogs in their own dog phase, instead of the dog dying and being gone from the fight permanently, on Heroic that dog will leave at 25% health, only to later return to help out and attack you basically during a different dog's phase. In addition to that, once all 3 dog phases are complete, they've all left the battlefield at 25%, they will return at the end and fight you at the same time. You'll have to deal with all 3 dogs at 25% health plus Iron Quan, and kill the dogs at that point, at which time they'll be gone for good, and you just deal with Iron Quan at the end. So that's just a general thing to keep in mind as we go through the phases and talk about how those are different on Heroic because of that mechanic where the dogs don't actually die. So for the first phase against Rorschach, this is probably the most technically difficult phase in terms of raid awareness, positioning. There's also a lot of healing to do on this phase. And the main thing is dealing with the sheer amount of potential burst damage from the dogs that are active during this phase, as well as managing positions of your raid members to avoid mechanics that are going on. So let's just go through the mechanics here and what you need to do to manage them. So the main consideration here for this phase is the combination of Unleashed Flame and Throw Spear. So I list both these together because by themselves, they're not all that dangerous. But the problem is the positioning and timing necessary to deal with these effects throughout the fight. So if you haven't seen it or you don't know the exact specifics, you can watch the normal guide. For this fight, I talk about the energy regen mechanics and the rates and all that stuff for Unleash Flame on this phase. But for now, I'll assume on Heroic, you're going to know the basics of how it works. The problem is that on Heroic, Unleash Flame does 950,000 fire damage split when it's launched at a group of players. So even with no Scorch stacks, a group of 3 players are going to take about 315,000 damage baseline. So obviously it's a big chunk of damage. And then on Heroic, if you add in the Scorch stacks, this is another 20% each time you get a stack. So even with low stacks of Scorched, this is a lot of burst damage. This also combines with other effects in the phase, like Inferno, that can do unavoidable damage, or when we talk about the lightning effects from Quet'zal, then that's also part of it. So the main issue is finding a reliable way to position your raid while also allowing you to deal with the healing necessary from Unleash Flame. But on top of that, avoiding spears that are thrown out fairly regularly. So there's a few things you can do to help yourself with that, and I'll talk about the method that we're doing here that ultimately led to our victory. So the first thing I want to highlight is as we begin the fight, take special note of the positioning of our raid members. So we have the boss pretty much where he lands, just about on the stairs with melee and stuff behind him. But then we have our 2 ranged groups, which are 3 players each, move up toward the stairs and sort of stand on or around the stairway. Now the reason for this is that we want that first spear that always targets a ranged player to land as far away from the center of the room as possible, preferably near a wall as well. So all our ranged are standing about max range, and when that first spear comes out, there it was on my group on my side, we can immediately move toward the front of the room relative to the spear's landing location. So when the spear hit, all 3 of our ranged raid members in my group here moved to the left facing the boss or toward the entrance. That way, no matter where the fire trails went, we were safely on this side of those trails and that spear, so that the next spear and the next time they have to move, we can again move more toward the entrance, and so on and so forth. And the group to my right now, the other range group, did the same thing. So there you see they moved just to the side toward the entrance of that existing flame trail, so that when the second spear was thrown, landing on them, they again moved toward the entrance, and they're on the safe side of existing flame trails. And this is not, a perfect system, but it works really well once you get it down. The basic idea is to always position yourself when a spear is about to be thrown with your back as close to an existing flame trail as possible, or to the wall if there isn't a flame trail blocking you. And then you can move further toward the entrance where the boss should naturally want to go as flame trails start to build up on the floor. So that's the best thing you can do to help yourself with spear management, is to position the raid so that you are pushing these spears toward the outside edges of the room and toward existing flame trails in the safe sections. So if a flame trail exists, stand just near the edge of it, so your back is to the flame trail, far away from the boss. And if a spear gets thrown at you, then you immediately move toward the entrance side, depending on which side you're on. And this way you can then dodge the flame trail that comes from the next spear as well. And you still have that open gap at which, position you can basically always safely move in. So this works really well. And once you get some practice down with it, then the flame trails from spears and the spears themselves should not be very damaging. So the next thing to consider is how you will deal with Unleash Flame and the positioning in groups to handle it. So the best thing we found to do was to use 3 groups of 3 players for Unleash Flame. And each group would go up to a stack of 3 Scorch before spreading out again and allowing the next group to stack. Now technically, because of the timing, you can go up to 2 stacks of Scorch only using 3 different groups and have the Scorch stacks drop during the rotation. But the problem that we found is if you use 2 stacks, then the timing of when a particular group is stacking up does not coincide well with the spears that are being thrown. And on Heroic, the extra damage from spears, especially if you get hit by Cinder as well, is a lot of damage during Unleash Flame. So instead, what we found, it was better to actually go up to 3 stacks on each of the groups, because this way you can actually stack up and spread out around the timing of spears. So as we go through the fight again here, I'll just walk through it briefly and show you what I mean. So for this first spear, all our ranged players are spread out kind of toward the stairs, and the spear can of course land anywhere. So it's going to hit my group here, go for our priest in just a second. There's the spear. Come on, spear. There it is. Okay. So now, once that spear's gone out, our melee group, which was stacked up at the start of the fight, so that they don't have to deal with spear, they just hit 3 stacks of Scorch. So as soon as that spear goes out, my group, which is the next group in the Unleash Flame rotation, we stack up on the safe side of the spear, like you see here, and we go up to 3 stacks of Unleash Flame, or Scorch rather. So now once we have 3 stacks, we spread out. This occurs about 5 to 7 seconds before the next spear. And then we wait for the second spear to be thrown. And again, you're trying to maximize your distance from the boss and toward the back of the room, the walls. So that spear went for the other group, which is fine. So they move again toward the entrance, the safe side of the spear, and then they stack up and get their 3 stacks of Unleash Flame. And once their 3 stacks are done, then the melee group will be up again in the rotation. And since they can't be a target of spear, then it's just up to the ranged players to stay spread and max range in case they get targeted by spear. Now around this time, once the melee hits another 3 stacks, depending on your DPS, you probably will be pushing the dog. But if not, the rotation will just keep going. So after that 3rd spear, the second group, or the first ranger group in our case, which was my group, would stack up again. We would go up to 3 stacks, and it would just keep going over and over. But otherwise, you just keep this rotation and do it around the spear timing, and then you never have to worry about whether a spear is landing on your group if you're a ranged group while you're stacked up for Unleash Flame. So even though you get an extra tick of Unleash Flame and an extra Scorch stack, that damage is counteracted by the fact you don't have to deal with the spear while you're doing stacks. So highly recommend this method. I think it worked really well for us. And especially if you have enough melee, which you will. If you have 1 melee and 2 tanks, then you'll have enough for a 3 stack group in your melee range. And then you can just let your ranged do the other 2 groups. So yeah, I would recommend that for Unleash Flame. So the final stuff to deal with in the first phase while you're fighting Rorschach is the introduction of Quet'zal and a few of his abilities. So this is a trend that continues throughout the first 3 phases, where you basically deal with one of the other dog's mechanics, or some of them, while you're actually fighting the primary dog phase. So Quet'zal uses 2 basic abilities during this phase. The first is a whirling wind attack. You see it there in the top of the screen, floating across. And this is used fairly infrequently, but he lands in some random spot in the room, and about every 30 seconds, he'll shoot a tornado at a random raid member. This tornado does about 200,000 damage to any player it hits and knocks them back a few yards. So, since it's an AE and it's going to be shooting at a random raid member, typically it will do the most damage when it's aimed toward a group that's stacked for Unleash Flame, or your melee, since they're kind of all grouped together. It is avoidable, you can sidestep it, but the big thing is if you move somewhere where you're not supposed to be and end up stacking up for Unleash Flame validity, meaning you're close enough to two other players, when you're not supposed to be, then that could screw up your Scorch rotation. So you just need to be aware of where it's going, and if you have to move, make sure you can move safely without screwing up these Scorched and Unleashed Flame stack. So the best thing we've found to handle it was just to have everyone watch for it and communicate quickly. So everyone in the raid pretty much is watching where he's landing, and they look where he's facing when he's about to cast it, and then they'll call out, it's going toward melee group, or it's going toward the, Koldar group on my side, or whatever it is. And that way we can sort of prepare for it or move out of the way, depending on the situation. If you can't move because you're stacking for Unleashed Flame, just make sure you have a cooldown or enough healing available to you to soak up that damage, because 200,000 damage plus a tick of Unleashed Flame is quite a bit, obviously. But otherwise, it's not the biggest issue. The other ability from Quet'zal is far more annoying, and this is the ability he uses on his normal phase, which is the Arcing Lightning. So just like in the normal version, he'll cast this on a random ranged raid member, and that player will be stunned and absorb heals, and they'll also apply a 30-second dot to someone that gets in range or clicks on them. So the problem is, obviously on this phase, you have a lot of other mechanics to deal with, especially damage. And in the case of Unleashed Flame groups, when those three players are stacking for Unleashed Flame and have Arcing Lightning on them, they're all going to be taking that Arcing Lightning damage. And that's a huge amount of extra damage. So it's around 45,000 every 2 seconds for the 30-second duration. So your healer or healers in your group need to be very aware of Arcing Lightning, especially when Unleashed Flame is active. And don't be afraid to use cooldowns. You should use all your survival cooldowns during this phase while you're stacked for Unleashed Flame especially, because you're not going to really need many for the second phase, and you won't need any cooldowns for the third dog phase. The only time you'll need them again is potentially on the final burn phase, and certainly at the very end of the fight, but that's a long ways from this point. So I recommend using all your survival cooldowns when you stack for Unleashed Flame to deal with Arcing Lightning, especially if you have that. So once you get Rorschach to 25%, he will go away, and you'll deal with Quet'zal as your primary dog in Phase 2. So this phase is quite easy. There's not a lot to worry about here. The only real concern is the windstorm part of the phase. And this doesn't occur very frequently, but in terms of functionality, it's just like the normal version. So you'll get sucked into the middle, and you have to make your way out of the windstorm before you can actually effectively heal and stop taking as much damage. Now the problem is that, generally speaking, you will have Arcing Lightning active while you go into the windstorm, and it will therefore spread to everyone else in the raid, and this is a lot of extra damage. Now the other problem is that while you're getting sucked in here and stunned, you can't actually cast until you break free of the stun and are allowed to move again. So it's really important that everyone in your raid that has a personal cooldown available uses it just before the windstorm actually hits and sucks you in, and that stun occurs. If you wait until after the stun, you're going to spend that whole duration while you're sucked in and stunned, taking damage, but not getting any reduction. And that's a good half of the time that you should be in the windstorm in the first place. So we found it was much more effective to actually use personal damage reduction cooldowns just before the windstorm sucks you in. The timer is very accurate from boss mods. So just at 1 or 2 seconds before, use a damage reduction or whatever you have, and then you will have that reduction throughout most of the windstorm, if not the whole thing, depending on your timing. And then once you get out of it, then you shouldn't be low enough, or too low health to actually get healed and survive. Now, just like normal, you may sort of ignore windstorm, but if not, the main mechanics apply here. So you want to run out quickly, go toward the entrance side of the room, that's the safest area, and make sure you save your big healing cooldowns if you're a healer for the moment that you get out of the windstorm. If you use them while you're inside, they'll obviously be reduced and basically be ineffective. So you can see here at the start of the phase, once that's clear from fire paths, I know there's not a lot of damage, so I go over and drop my Transcendence portal. And if you had a Warlock, this would be the time for them to set up their portal. Other monks can obviously do the same if they're not tanking, that kind of stuff. But basically anything that can allow you to get outside of the windstorm immediately or quickly will be very beneficial to you. So we also have our Druid use her raid sprint when the windstorm breaks and we're able to run. And really anything you have that'll increase your movement and survivability should be used on this phase, because again, the third phase, you won't need any cooldowns for survival. It's really simple. So here we're getting sucked in again, and now we get to break free. So as a monk, I found I can roll forward immediately, go between the first set of tornadoes. The pattern for tornadoes is always the same. That's really important to remember. So once you find a path and a system that works for you personally, you can repeat it every time. There's no reason to think about, is it going to change this time? Just, wait for that same tornado to pass in front of you, for example, at the same timing, and then, use your roll twice like I did there, or use your roll once and pour it out if you have Transcendence up, which I didn't have to do, but I always just like to have in case I need it. But yeah. The basic pattern is always the same for the tornadoes and the timing. So find something that works for you quickly and that allows you to get out fast without hitting a tornado, and then you can just repeat that over and over. Now, one thing that's really important to consider in this phase as well as the previous phase, where you're also dealing with arcing lightning, is your positions and basically how you will handle arcing lightning casts. It does a lot of damage on heroic, and obviously because it absorbs healing, any other damage that's happening at the same time is really going to hinder those players that are afflicted. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to use a buddy system, just like in grade school, perhaps. Basically, if you're a ranged player that's a valid target for arcing lightning, have a partner that's always within a few yards of you during the first and the second phase when arcing lightning is valid. And just be ready to click on your partner if they get the arcing lightning, and vice versa. If you get it, call out to your partner and say, hey, I've got it, or whatever. You also might want to use the ability that your boss mods usually have to announce in the say channel if you have arcing lightning, because players with chat bubbles turned on can easily see near them if they see someone saying, hey, I've got arcing lightning, click me. That will come in handy as well. But the basic idea is to position properly near your partner, and that way you can each see when the other one gets arcing lightning within a few seconds at most, and click them off right away. So the way we handled it was pretty much to retain our groups from the first phase in terms of range positions. So when we move into this entrance side here after the first windstorm, our group that was on the side that I'm on now, which is the south, it looks like, yeah. So the trio of south players stay on the south side here, and so in this case it's the priest, mage, and myself. And when one of them gets arcing lightning, they can click each other. As a monk healer, I'm not a valid target for arcing lightning, so I stay out for a little bit, but then eventually go into melee range here to help do damage. But that's the basic idea, is so you stay on your same relative side at max range, and then you can click arcing lightning quickly. So the other trio of, or other duo of ranged players, which is our druid and our paladin, are on the other side doing the same thing. Because in this case we have 4 melee DPS, so there's a lot of people in melee range. But yeah, that's basically the tip, is just find a buddy, stay at max range, watch for that arcing lightning quickly, and you should be able to get it off. So, although it's not really dangerous, I should briefly mention that the extra dog abilities you're dealing with on Phase 2 while fighting Quet'zal is from Dameron. So again, it's the dog that follows the one you're actually fighting that will add on something to the phase. In this case, Dameron's extra abilities are very minor and easy to deal with. He'll basically randomly shatter someone and use a spike as well to knock someone in the air, do a little bit of damage. So you can kind of see the spikes in the background every once in a while. The problem is, or not the problem, but the good news is that they don't do very much damage at all. So the majority of the damage from this phase will come from arcing lightning pretty much. And that's about it, other than the windstorm I talked about before. But other than that, the actual damage from Dameron and the stuff you have to deal with is very minor. You really don't have to do anything to avoid it. You can't avoid it. So basically just stay spread out, deal with arcing lightning damage and windstorm, and then just heal through the extra damage from Dameron. It's pretty minor. So that's it. Let's move on to the third dog. So the final dog, of course, is Dameron when you deal with Quet'zal, and he's at 25 and he goes away. So Dameron is really the regeneration phase. This is the easiest phase in terms of damage and all mechanics and all that stuff. So you still have Dead Zone, and he still throws spears, obviously, with frost stuff. So again, your range should stay max range and spread out for spears. Other than that, you'll probably have a few arcing lightnings still active on your range players. So make sure they stay spread so that those can fade during this phase, and that'll lower the damage that needs to be healed. Other than Dameron, though, you will also have to deal with Rorschach. So obviously there isn't a dog that follows Dameron in the rotation, so it just repeats back to the beginning and you deal with Rorschach on this phase. So all this really means is that Rorschach will fly around and he'll drop Unleashed Flame on a random group of players, whichever group he can find that's stacked up the most. And he'll do this about every 31 or 32 seconds. So what this means effectively is that he doesn't do it frequently enough to keep Scorch stacks going, even if you cast on the same group. So you may notice that our melee are getting the stack because we have a lot of melee, including myself. So our stack dropped a few seconds ago, and then he recast another Unleashed Flame. So now we have one stack of Scorched again. And then it will drop again, and then he'll cast another one after it drops. And this process just repeats over and over. So in terms of worrying about Scorch stacking, it's really not a big deal. The only thing you have to be concerned about is that if you don't have enough players stacked up in this phase against Dameron, then Unleashed Flame will be cast on a random player. And obviously one person soaking Unleashed Flame will probably die. So it's important that you have enough players stacked up to soak this during this phase, that they, won't get one shot. So I would recommend melee because obviously you're going to have at least one tank, maybe two, so you can stack up on the tank if necessary, and just have at least 3 or 4 players stacking up and soaking that damage. But otherwise, it's pretty minor. It's just a little bit of spike damage that you have to be ready for. But since your melee shouldn't really take any other damage during this phase, as long as they avoid the ground effects from the spear, then it shouldn't be that dangerous, and you have enough time to heal them up to full health before the next Unleashed Flame is cast. So that's pretty much it. Dameron's very easy. So make sure your healers regen during this phase. You want to have as much mana as possible in preparation for the final phase where healing really ramps up and you kind of have a burn, soften rage situation. Now once you get Dameron to 25%, the fourth phase will begin. And during this phase, all 3 dogs will become active simultaneously and re-engage your raid, along with Iron Quan. So you have to deal with all 4 bosses at the same time. So if you're using one tank for this fight, that tank needs to make sure that they have all their cooldowns ready to go at the start of this phase. You also probably want to clear your Impale stack on the tank just before this phase begins, so that you are, taking as little damage as possible during this period, because that's a lot of stuff hitting the tank. Outside of that, this is really a DPS burn phase for your damage players. So don't be afraid. In fact, I would suggest that your DPS save their DPS cooldowns while you're fighting Dameron leading up to this phase, because you don't really need to burn Dameron down very quickly, and because of his shield, it's hard to do so anyway. But instead, you really want to have your DPS cooldowns available for this period, because the idea here is to kill the dogs as fast as possible. While these dogs are active in this fourth phase, they will be using pretty much all of their abilities from the previous phases when that dog was the active target. So this means that you have Unleashed Flame with the same frequency as you saw in the first phase. You have Inferno from Rorschach as well. You have Arcing Lightning that you have to deal with, so make sure your ranged members are spread out, max range, with their partners, all that good stuff. You have the spikes and the frost shatters as well. So it's minor damage, but it's something to consider. So basically all that stuff, except for the major cooldown abilities like Windstorm, you won't have that. But everything else is pretty much active. So you really need to burn these dogs down as quickly as possible, because as soon as the dog dies, of course, it stops using its abilities that it's adding to the fight. So I recommend killing Rorschach first, because Unleashed Flame is by far the most damaging ability in this phase. And if you don't kill him fast enough, the Unleashed Flame stacks will get out of control very quickly. Now you can choose to do a rotation like you did in the first phase to deal with Unleashed Flame, but because the dog only has 25% health, or slightly lower perhaps, and this is sort of a DPS burn phase, I recommend just stacking up as many people as you can safely to soak up the Unleashed Flame, and then just burn Rorschach down quickly before that becomes unhealable damage. So because we have so much melee DPS, we just basically stack all our melee on top of the tank once that Unleashed Flame gets too high, and then just heal through that damage and use a few cooldowns if needed, but otherwise you're just basically burning Rorschach first, and then you can worry about the other two dogs without as much pressure. Okay, so you've killed all the dogs up to this point, and now you're on the final phase. And this is just like the normal version in terms of mechanics. You just deal with Iron Quan by himself, and he uses Fist Smash, I can't speak, pretty frequently, and also gains stacks of Rising Anger. Now, even though the tooltip says 10% damage increase from Rising Anger, as best as I can tell from the logs and the damage that was actually dealt, it's actually 7.5% per stack that he gains. So still a lot, but it's not quite the 10% that it seems to indicate. And that matches up with the damage you see in the logs. Anyway, during this phase, he gains 1 stack of Rising Anger every 15 seconds. And this goes up to 30 stacks at max, I believe. Not that you'll reach that point. And then every 30 seconds, he does Spear Throw and follows it up with a Fist Smash. Now, the first Smash and Spear Throw are 60 seconds into the phase. So 60 seconds after you push Dameron 25%, Iron Quan will do his first throw and Fist Smash combo, regardless of what the status is of the dogs. Oftentimes, depending on your DPS, you will have some of the dogs still alive during this first smash. So it's really important that you have some plan in place to deal with that damage, because it's going to be quite a bit of damage, with one of the dogs still active and the Fist Smash going off. After that first one goes off 60 seconds into the phase, all subsequent smashes are 30 seconds apart on average. So this means that the first smash, he has 4 stacks of Rising Anger. So if you look at this chart in the bottom left, you can see all the numbers here. So the first smash there at 60 seconds time, ignore the outgoing DPS for now. He has 4 stacks of Rising Anger all the way on the right column. So this means that the damage per person from Fist Smash is 390,000 total on average, and the DPS to the raid is 520,000. Since it occurs over 7.5 seconds, you can calculate what that damage is. So each subsequent Fist Smash after the first is 30 seconds apart, and it's going to do about 15% more damage than the previous one because he has 2 extra stacks of Rising Anger. So if you look down the chart, you can see that for our kill, for example, we killed him around the 6th smash, and that meant that the time was about 210 seconds into the phase. We did around 741,000 DPS to to Iron Quan himself during this period to actually kill him in that period. And the damage per person, 615,000 DPS to the raid is 820,000. So it's a lot of damage. The main thing you have to concern yourself with in this phase is a cooldown rotation of some sort to deal with all the fist smash. Now, in terms of positioning, you can help yourself a little bit because the actual spear throw mechanic targets a random ranged raid member, just like it does in the rest of the fight. And the spear throw itself has a radius attack. It seems to be around 10 yards or so around the targeted person. And anyone within those 10 yards gets hit by some extra physical damage when the spear actually gets thrown. So what we try to do is to make a triangle formation here in this final phase. So we have our ranged players in two parts of the triangle split up evenly, and then our melee sort of dispersed in the front and the sides as well. So that any given spear throw is generally only going to hit 2, maybe 3 players at most. Whereas if you were all stacked up just in the center, you would all take that damage from that spear throw. And that's just unnecessary spike damage that you don't want to take, especially when you're starting the fist smash phase. So try to do that if you can. Position players kind of in small groups so that the throw damage is lower. And otherwise you can actually have your range stay spread out if you don't need to be stacked up for healing efficiency. But most groups will probably want to be close for the heals. As for a cooldown rotation, it's obviously just up to your raid's makeup, and I can't really give any major tips on it. So we would just basically had 1 major cooldown or 2 minor cooldowns for every fist smash. So we would use our priest bubble for one that went off just a moment ago. We have our rogue's smoke bomb. That's really effective for people that can be in that, as well as our banner from our warrior. So those are a couple minor ones. We have revival from me as a mistweaver. Unfortunately, our healer paladin can't do much with aura mastery. It does affect the fire damage, of course, that's coming from the tornado, but not the actual smash. And so at the very end, I think the final smash, we didn't have a damage reduction cooldown, so we used our druid's tranquility, which is ultra buffed. So even though the incoming damage on the raid was effectively the base value, times the rising stack damage, we didn't reduce it. The tranquility was able to heal enough along with the regular healing to survive that. So yeah, that's really it. Just try to figure out from the DPS chart how much raid DPS you have on average, considering that that's the damage you have to deal to Iron Quan in the phase, and you also have to kill the 3 dogs as well. So make sure you account for damage to the dogs. But then you can plan sort of, okay, we're probably going to get 7 smashes or 5 smashes, whatever it might be. And then you can have a rotation kind of prepared so that you can survive the damage. And that should cover it, I think. So that is the heroic Iron Quan fight. It's pretty challenging, but really you just practice each phase on its own, and the transitions between them are not all that complicated. So once you get one phase down, you can pretty much move on to the next one, and it gets easier and easier until the final phase against all the dogs. And then you have this burn, and hopefully you can get them down. So good luck, thanks for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe.